Hello, good afternoon, and thanks for joining this seminar. My name is Roland Kluger. I'm governor of the Hebrew U and vice president of the Friends in Paris. I've been involved with Hebrew U for the last 20 years, if not more. And for the last 30 years, I live in Paris, but I come from Brussels. I'm Belgian. In fact, I was born in France during the war, where our family was hidden for 2 years in a small village called Villeneuve-de-Berg, somewhere in the mountains in France. My personal relationship with the Holocaust is that on one end, my father's family, coming from Antwerp, were hidden and went through the war in that little village where I was born. Unfortunately, on my mother's side, they were from Poland and lived in Poland, and they've all been destroyed. So I never met them, grandparents, aunts, etc. I visited Auschwitz with the CRIF some years back. And on this day, in fact, if we look at the agenda, we are now 160 days into that war, starting on October 7th. Agenda have their own life. On Friday, last Friday, there was an important event taking place in the La Haye in Holland about the first decision from the court. And it was indeed quite something to see Israel, Jews, accused of genocide. I would say it's quite a snapshot to history. You might have read the book of Philip Sander about the birth and how the word and the concept genocide came up during the war. And after that important court decision, the next day, we had the Holocaust Remembrance Day. Just to say a little word about France, in France today, on the national channel, they are putting on air on prime time Shoah, the film from Lanzmann, and it's a film which is on for 9 hours. So they will air it from starting at 9 p.m. till the end, which is like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And France 2 is one of the top stations like NBC, CBS, etc. And one last word is about what's happening also in France about anti-Semitism, which after October 7 went up like 1,000%, which is a lot. And it's a real problem, even more than it was in the past. Let me now go over to the campaign. You're all aware of We Are One. And there are now basically 3 projects about the campaign. The first one, we already have had a wonderful and interesting seminar about traumatic stress and recovery. And the French friends will certainly focus on that seminar, on that situation, to raise and fundraising. The second theme covers children and their mental health, which is also of great interest. And the third about Jews and Arabs at the Hebrew U. Let me now say a couple of words about Professor Halbertal. He's John and Gola Cohen Professor of Jewish Thought and Philosophy at Hebrew University. He is Gruss Professor at New York Law School and a member of Israel National Academy for Science and Humanities. He has written some important books like Idolatry, The Beginning of Politics, Power in the Biblical Book of Samuel, which I just looked at and I'm certainly going to read because I found the subject topic quite fascinating. His latest book is Namanid, Law and Mysticism. And I will say, I will put now, Professor, the floor is yours, even on Zoom, you know.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much for having me here. And also as a faculty of the Hebrew University is also an opportunity to express my gratitude for so much of your support, Ronald and others in supporting, helping the Hebrew University and its flourishing. So really from the bottom of my heart, thank you all for that and for your contribution. The topic of our lecture is confronting evil yesterday and today, and I want to start with a certain reflection on evil. And my address would not be trying to understand the phenomenon or trying to explain how people do such things, etc. My interest is actually in a way in which the Jewish people confronted evil, responded to it, and in particular, its mechanisms of resilience, of overcoming such magnitude of death and crisis. So what are the secrets of maintaining and flourishing, or resilience, continuity? What can we learn from post-Holocaust and maybe during the Holocaust, and also what can we learn about contemporary crises that we're facing? But one thought about evil is a way in which a political program of elimination, when we're talking about genocide, and Ronald, you have opened our discussion with the mentioning of the category of genocide. Genocide is a form of harm. Nations harm one another, nations wrong one another, nations behave bad to one another in many ways, crimes are performed. But when we talk about evil, it has a form, one way of looking at evil, it has a form of eliminating the other in its totality. It's not a clash about interest, it's about dehumanizing the whole group and members of those groups because qua members of this group, dehumanizing them, and also demonizing them, because anti-Semitism is not a prejudice. You know, people have prejudices about one another. Groups have some very wrong ones, some very false one, etc. But anti-Semitism is not a mere prejudice. It's a form of hatred. And it's a very old hatred. And its source is viewing, in the case of the Jews, the Jewish people, viewing these people as the source of your troubles, as something demonic that if you get rid of, if you eliminate, somehow your world will be redeemed, saved. So there is this elimination phenomenon that has to do with genocide. And Primo Levi said in his reflection on what was so monstrous about the Holocaust, he said, well, we think as well about the mass killing of children, you know, because they're Jews. But there was a thing of taking the elderly from old age homes. There was so monstrous in itself that shows the desire, the aim of eliminating. So evil is a form of elimination project. When we talk about political evil, it's a form of radical political evil. It's a form of an elimination project that involves dehumanizing a group. And not only dehumanizing, taking this group as a scapegoat, as a group that is perceived as the source of the pain, hate, failures of your society, the aggressor society. Hence it's a form of hatred. Now, I want to say something about contemporary condition, and then I'm going to address the issue of confronting evil. Clearly, Israel has faced since the 7th of October, but a kind of an attack that was indiscriminate, that aimed to kill people because they're Israelis and Jews, just because of that. And it's nourished by a certain ideology, genocidal ideology of Hamas. But it also involved a certain alarming aspect in world opinion, or certain aspects of world opinion, in which Israel's very existence, very legitimate existence, is questioned. Not Israel's wrongs, and Israel clearly has wronged or have wrongs, etc. But the very existence of Israel as such, based in three accusations, kind of a Trinitarian original sins that is ascribed to Israel. And I want to talk about that. I've been in faculty at NYU Law School, and I've been looking at the American situation and the way the framing of Israel has been published, were a kind of a bizarre, I would say, shared of aims between the Hamas eliminationist ideology and certain elements in the very, very far left. And they have to do with the idea that Israel's right to exist, these questions. And it's based on three framing structures. The first one is the perception. I want to address them one by one because we have to rebut them and answer them. The first one is Israel is a settler colonial state. And everybody knows that colonialism is that every decent person really dislikes or resents or has a moral outrage towards colonialism. And there is a framing of Israel as a colonial project. And I want to address this issue because it keeps on repeating again and again and again. Colonialism has three wrongs in it. It has to do with you having a home. A nation has a home, like Belgium, and then it established a colony. Let's say in the case of Belgium, the colony in Africa, in Congo, or the French in Algeria, or the Spanish, an earlier form of settler colonialism in the Americas. You have a home base and you establish a colony. Now, the Jews didn't have a home base. Palestine, Israel, wasn't a colony of the Jewish people. Actually, we have to remember Zionism was a movement of refugees, people who have been repressed, persecuted, hated, and then at the end eliminated in their Eastern European, Western European places. So it's not like, well, Zionism is a colonial movement. It didn't have a home base to establish the colony. Zionism is, in a deep way, a movement of refugees seeking some haven, some home where they'll be safe. So that's the first feature. The second feature of colonialism is that colonial powers don't have any attachment to the place they come to, the place they conquer, control, exploit, etc., etc. Again, in the case of Belgium and Congo, or the case of other colonial powers, they didn't have any attachment. Well, Jews had an ongoing attachment to the land, to the Holy Land, to the land of Israel. It's not an alien area to them. They are, in many ways, an indigenous population of the land. The third wrong in colonialism is that colonial powers extract extract some goods that are created, manufactured in the place they colonize, right? Now, there wasn't much extraction and exploitation in Palestine. It wasn't about taking the goods of this land and shipping them to the home base or to the settling community as such. So the whole analogy of Israel, of Zionism to a colonial project is a very morally wrong framing to start with. But at the moment you frame Israel in that category, what you establish is a delegitimization and an eliminationist project vis-a-vis the state of Israel. Then there is the other accusation of genocide. Israel is right, and we've just witnessed Israel being on trial on genocide. Well, genocide is an attempt by a nation or by a state to eliminate a group. And I remember I was in NYU when I was there at the fall. I went to a few demonstrations just to see the kind of anti-Israel demonstrations, and I saw a sign on Israel performing an ongoing genocide. And I asked the person carrying the signs, I asked him, do you know how many Palestinians were in Gaza in 1967? He didn't know because they're not that informed. I said 350,000 Palestinians were in Gaza in 1967. I asked him, do you know how many Palestinians are in Gaza now? He said, I don't know. I said, there are 2.3 million. That's a growth. It's a very blessed growth of population. This has nothing to do with genocide. I mean, go ask the Armenians in Anatolia what is genocide, or if this was genocide I think if I take a Jewish community in Europe at the Holocaust of the same size, let's say the Hungarian Budapest community, there should have been now 6 million Jews in Hungary. So there is an accusation, a very flawed framing of Israel as genocidal that has very little to do with the reality on the ground. Again, that doesn't mean that we don't wrong. We don't have wrongs that we have to correct. We don't have to look at the way we use power and other things, etc. But the framing of Israel as both colonial and genocide engages a deep delegitimation of its very existence in the way in which eliminationist fantasies are flourishing. The third accusation is apartheid. So these are the three wrongs of Western civilization, the horrors of Western civilizations, the genocide, colonialism, and apartheid. Israel is an apartheid state. Well, apartheid means this is a racial conflict, but anybody who understands the conflict in Israel, it's not a racial conflict. It's a national conflict. And within the Green Line, the Arab citizens of Israel are integrated, are part of the society. At the Hebrew University, we have a wonderful group of Arab Palestinian students in hospitals, at the court, in the Knesset. These are mixed cities. Again, this doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have a way to go in terms of improving its relationship with its Arab citizens, as well as thinking about what is the conditions in the West Bank, etc. But to understand Israel as such, as an apartheid state, which means that the conflict is racial in its essence, it's I would say it's a demonization of Israel in a way that it frames it as an illegitimate state. We have to understand that this is what's going on in certain elements, in certain aspects. Not all of criticism of Israel is of that nature, but that very framing coalesces with this idea of uprooting, of delegitimizing the very right of self-determination of a nation within system. So I wanted to mention that by way of understanding where we are in terms of framing the conflict, what are the questions that emerges within it, and in what way there is a kind of complex connection with delegitimation, elimination, uprooting that has to do with the politics of radical evil. Now, I want to address then my other question, and I come here as well as a son of Holocaust survivors. And I mean, many of us are second generation or we have known survivors. And one thing I want to reflect about in terms of understanding Jewish history, it's the power of overcoming. I think there is something in the history of our people that has remarkable resilience in facing evil, and I'm in facing such magnitude of crisis of destruction in a way of Holocaust. And I'm looking at my parents' generation. I think so many of us know it. Their resilience, their way of building a whole life after death. And in reflecting on that death, I want to speak about 4 dimensions that seem to me very important, very crucial, kind of lessons of life. The first one is the affirmation of life. I mean, the commitment to life. Our culture is not a death culture. It affirms life. I have relatives who, in 1941, in the Lodz ghetto, were asking whether they ought to be married. Is it right to get married? And there's a great rabbi who said, sure, of course. You know, it's kind of this drive to life that is so powerful. The culture of life affirmation. V'chai b'hem. Pikuach nefesh. You know, this idea. There is no, I must say, craving to death and martyrdom, but affirming life. Very deep. The second aspect, I would say, is rebuilding, forward-looking rather than revenge. I think our parents' generation with this such power had this forward-looking way. They didn't dedicate their future to revenging the past wrongs. It's a big force. It's a way of overcoming you being defined by the wrong done to you. And I think that's part of the immense phenomenon of rebuilding after the Holocaust. And the third element, which is, I think, very deep, has to do with a certain deep-seated belief that the nation, the people, is immortal, that there is a promise of the eternity of our people, and the belonging to that community of solidarity gave them a lot of power to continue. It's interesting. I have a very dear friend whose mother was one of them Mengele's twins who went through this horror of experimentation. And when she used to talk to my friend's child, a son of hers, and she said, you know, why did I continue? I mean, after all of I said, why was I the one to survive? And the idea is that I have the responsibility to keep it going. It's kind of a deep, deep responsibility we share to something that is beyond us. That's something very powerful. Thinking about my father and others, and I'm sure it might resonate with so much of you as well. And the fourth thing, I think, it's the power of learning, of of the capacity to survive beyond the actual conditions that define you through a spiritual anchor of Torah, of text, of culture, that value world that makes us transcend the condition of the here and now. It's very deep. And when I think not only on resistance after the Holocaust, this whole life affirmation, but during the Holocaust, there was something personal when I asked my father, how did you endure all that? How did you come out of it? And he says to me something I wish I would raise to that quality of character, but I think it talks to many of us. He says, you know, Moshe, every place I was, there was someone in a worse condition than me. Wherever we were. And I tried to help that person, and that's what kept me going. And when I think about this, what is that secret? Because during the Holocaust, people were put in conditions of dehumanization. And part of being dehumanized is that your sole aim is your survival, your personal survival. You're reduced to a survival animal. And by transcending your survival, your mere survival, through act of giving, it has such power. You know, I talk to survivors, and unfortunately, we are of a generation that the survivors are not going to be among us for a long time. And many of them say, I survived because I cared for my sister. I survived because I cared for that person and the other person. It has a confronting dehumanization through the capacity to transcend your condition through giving at that moment. And there were other forms of resisting dehumanization. I'm thinking about in the Vilna ghetto, where the persistence of maintaining the Strashun library through the war, the library, bringing kids to read. There is more heroism in that than heroism in battlefield. I mean, it's so powerful. And I think about the people in the ghetto of Warsaw the historians in the ghetto of Warsaw who had the project of Oinek Shabbos, where they recorded the history of the ghetto and hide it within barrels and buried them. And this idea of recording for the future that they had, this idea of there is a future, there will be a future. We're going to bear witness to a future. This is so, I would say, resources of resistance. So there is resistance while evil is being perpetrated. The resistance to dehumanization, and there were forms of resistance that took the form of rebellion, like the Warsaw Rebellion and other rebellions. That's one way. You know, I had a teacher, the head of my yeshiva, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he said, he was in the camps, and he said, you know, what was Shabbat in the camp? You know what I did in Shabbat? I took my shirt off and put it upside down and changed change its side and war it. It's an act of resistance. So I mark the Shabbat. I'm not fully defined by the enemy as someone who has no life, no symbolic world, no world of meaning. And that's a form of resistance while being dehumanized. And then there is the power of resisting evil after the destruction, the power of resilience. And I think when we look at the history of the people, our people, I mean, there are other histories of other people with their modes of overcoming, which has to be learned and thought through. And as a lesson, we're seeking lessons from the Holocaust. One of them is, I mean, there are many lessons clearly, but one of them is the awe we face of the generation of survivors, just rebuilding wherever they were, either in immigrating to Palestine, rebuilding Israel, in Australia, in the US, in South America, etc. There was a culture of rebuilding. I want to say one thing about which I think very important is that when you say they didn't dedicate their life to revenge, but rather to rebuild, that doesn't mean forgetting or repressing. It's while the interesting thing, it's while maintaining the memory. It's while being responsible to continuity of that world that was lost. So there is a lot of memory. It's not a rejection of the past. This forward looking is not a form of rejection of the past. So I would say celebrate, if that word can be used. I mean, celebrate the power of resilience, overcoming in this that involves both while being a victim of such evil and after the destruction. And what I mentioned, what I think, maybe just to begin thinking about it, those four elements. And I want to say, I mean, we're facing a crisis today, which is very different, clearly, because among other things, unlike the Holocaust, the people have resources, some resources of defining their future, taking charge of their future. And clearly there is a challenge, and I mean, I'm gonna finish in 5 minutes so we can have also a conversation and questions and answers. But saying forward looking, Israel and world Jewry is facing a major crisis. And what are the lessons that we can learn from this mode of confronting crisis, seeing hope? And in some ways, a lot of it is really about using those gifts that we were given in some ways by our parents' generation and of self-reliance, using them prudently, and keeping our values while engaging in that, because at the end, the source of the power to confront crisis, the power to confront Holocaust, destructions, etc., has to do with the capacity to lean back into deep values of both personal and collective, communal, that have to do with that. And I look at Jewish history on the whole. It's interesting. When you look at, let's say, you take the communities that were expelled from Spain in 1492 after the Spanish Inquisition, that, by the way, had this evil element, not genocidal in the same way, but this idea that Spain has to be cleaned completely from Jewish presence. And they come, these are broken people. These are people who have, their families were broken, everything they had was left, they were refugees. And they come to the Ottoman Empire. You know, they come to Turkey and they come to Saloniki. Saloniki was then part of the Ottoman Empire. And I remember visiting Saloniki. And the first thing those communities do, those people do, is first of all, they establish a community of solidarity that has welfare structures. It gives it gives safety nets to its members, It provides for the poor. It provides shelter, the communal power of safety net to the vulnerable. And then the other thing they do, they establish education. That's the secret. They establish schools, yeshivot. These are these are not affluent communities in that respect, but they do that. And also they establish another thing. They establish structures of authority that will allow them to resolve conflicts in different communal structures. These are communities that then becomes merchants involved in very complicated transactions. And they have this group of rabbis whom they rely on their integrity, and not because they have the power of the state behind them, but because they understand that they have structures of adjudication and communal work that they want to do. So these are both reflections on the nature of evil, some type of reflections, and then sharing with you what I think maybe it's not reflected enough. It's the post-Holocaust, the survivors, the generation of survivors and what they achieved as resilient people. And what was the source of their resilience while being in those death camps, concentration camps, but even that afterwards. So I wanted to share that with you, and I'll be happy to take questions. I know so many things are on your mind, so please feel free to take different angles that will contribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Halbertal. We do have a number of questions. I wanted to comment first, though, on how many parallels I hear in your words to what we're experiencing these days in Israel, going through the trauma that we're going through, especially the affirmation of life, the weddings that are happening all over the place, on army bases and in the middle of fields as people are waiting to go into Gaza. It's truly a lesson that we have learned, and thank you for bringing it up. We have a question from Rick Robbins, from our American friends, and he goes back to your 3 elements of colonialism, genocide, and apartheid. So I'll ask the question one at a time, I suppose. In discussing colonialism, do you think there is a useful distinction between the concept as you discussed it and the concept of settler colonialism?
So again, if you take settler colonialism, and we all are outraged by settler colonialism. So let's say British colonialism in India wasn't a settler colonialism. Well, there was a British presence in India that exploited the wealth of that country for the wealth of England, extracted surplus. And then we have French colonialism in Algeria that was a settler colonialism. We have white colonialism in South Africa, or we have the white men coming to the shores of Canada and engaging in colonial project, and also to a certain degree as well genocide. So what's wrong with settler colonialism? And then there's no distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism. I mean, but what's morally outrageous about it is you have a home, and then you settle in a place that that is a home of others, while you have a home somewhere else. You have established home. And as well, you have no historical bond and relationship to the place. And none of that existed in Zionist movement. It was, as I said, it wasn't a settler colonial power, because it didn't have a home base to have a colony or to settle in a colony. Now, again, by the way, that doesn't mean that there weren't moral dilemmas, moral wrongs as well involved in our assertion of self-determination, independence in the state of Israel. We have been in conflict with the Palestinians, and clearly we have to think about the past in an honest way, etc. But it's not about settler. I want to say one thing. If you look at the history of Zionism, Zionism managed to save around 300,000, 400,000 Jews from the beginning of the 20th century till 1938, because it was a movement of refugees. And by the way, the conflict was all over about immigration. What the Zionist movement wanted in the first place is to let us open the doors so we can have a home, given that we don't have a home. Jews came to their land from exile, not from having another home. Again, I'm saying, and this is very carefully, I want to express it and stress it. I'm talking not about, and we can have different political and moral outlooks on the conflict, and clearly everyone has his own views, etc. I think that we have to look at our past seriously and think about the ways, the wrongs that we have done, and I mean, there is a complex history, etc. But to framing within colonial framing, that means demonizing it as something that every decent person has to oppose, because every decent person seriously has to oppose colonialism and sort of the white man, etc., landing on the shores of Canada and other things, etc., or the Americans. And that's what I want to stress. It could be settler, it could be non-settler, but it always had those features that makes it so morally abhorrent.
I will just turn to the issue of apartheid, because I got two questions on apartheid, and both of them dealing less with the international recognized boundaries of Israel and Arab citizens of Israel, but more the areas that have been controlled by Israel for the past 60 years. And how do we address the accusation of apartheid when we're talking about those populations?
Well, this is a very good question. Again, me being in the Israeli center left or etc., I clearly think that, and I know there are many views or different views, etc., right, among us, among different people. I think that the only way that we will legitimately claim self-determination, national self-determination, and the Jewish state is by allowing and the flourishing of Palestinian self-determination next to us. And that means that the settlement project, as such, creating irreversible conditions of occupation, is a wrong. Again, if I talk about my parents, my mother, for example, had a completely different view on the subject, etc. So, yes, there is a wrong in that condition. I think it's a complex wrong because Israel did try to attempt to end the occupation through the 90s of the last century and the early in the 2000s, etc. There were attempts. And for that, you need a partner, and it's not clear to what degree there is a willing partner there, etc., etc. But we have to do our own effort to create the trust and partnership, etc. So clearly, this is something that we're going to have to heal. But again, apartheid is a different claim. And apartheid means that this is a racial conflict. I just want to say, by the way, many of the Jews are so-called brown Jews, and they're Arab, coming from Arab countries, etc. By the way, interestingly enough, ethnically cleansed from their home base, and they are in Israel. It's not a white versus brown. It's not a racial conflict in its nature. And if it was a racial conflict, then the 67 border wouldn't make sense, because actually race doesn't have borders, doesn't have boundaries. Now again, I would love to. These are my political convictions. This is etc. I would love to think about ways in which Palestinian right to self-determination will be affirmed, that the occupation will be ended, that and then other forms of ways in which occupation corrupts a society. So I have a lot of criticism, but I think framing it within the apartheid category is not a useful category. It's not. It also doesn't resonate with the experience of what apartheid is and what Israel is. Mm-hmm. So that would be my answer to a very, very good and complex question.
Thank you, Moshe. I want to give the floor to Roland, who has a question as well. Roland, feel free to just jump in.
Thank you. Well, I wasn't going as far as the apartheid. My question was really, if you look at it on a long period, is to find out that all of a sudden the Jews in Israel are in a different scenario. All what you have explained about the history was always, and we can say that living in diaspora, we can see the result of, in France, anti-Semitism, but you know, all that. All of a sudden, because you are a country, Israel is, the Jews are the majority. It's a different, it's a different ball game. And why does it change? I'm not going as far as that, but on the long run, it changed people, it changed the way you look at things. And and then it may end up with a different situation with people in Israel, the Jews in Israel and the diaspora, because the problems are not the same anymore. And you look at it. And I think that is how you make up for it. I don't know. But that to me is on a long-term basis, a big concern.
Right. So yes, we are in a different political world, right? And Jews are the majority in Israel. And by the way, we know how to be minority. We have to still learn how to be a majority.
Yes, that's what you said much better than that. That was my question. How do you learn that?
And we do. And by the way, apropos the Holocaust memory, it is, speaking about the place it has within Israeli life and politics, we have to be aware of not talking the language of the weak while having power. This is a complex, lethal structure, right? And sort of the lesson of the Holocaust is not, well, since all this is done to us, nobody can have any claim against us now. Now we are free to do, I would say, the license of the victim. I think it's wrong. I think, well, if this was done to us, that means that we have to be very aware of wrongs done to others among things that the wrongs done by us. Right? That's what the Torah said. You should remember the ger. The ger means the refugee, the one who has no land, because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. So the lesson of the Holocaust is not, well, now that we were victims, we have the license. Nobody can tell us anything. It's kind of, it gets you, it makes what William James called moral vacation. Now you are morally, no, we have, and by the way, I would say, are we holding on to the responsibility of never again when it comes to other things happening in the world? As a state, as a country, right? Are we taking in refugees of situations of horrible states, given our own experience of trying to find place? These are challenges. For clearly, there are many things to ask, and I would say that the perversion of the Holocaust memory will be using that memory as a form of license. I want to say one thing about relations of majority, minority, etc. We have to remember we're seeking solidarity, right? We're looking for a Jewish solidarity as a whole. And part of that means that Israel, in its action, is responsible for diaspora Jews. When it acts in the world, it has to take into account the state of the implications, the state of world Jews, etc., etc. When it actually legitimately calls world Jews to share in solidarity with its own fate, because we are one people. But if we are one people, then, one anecdote that I'm thinking about, if there was a case here that the deputy minister of the foreign minister kind of humiliated the Turkish ambassador. Well, if he does that, he has to remember that there is a Jewish community in Istanbul. It's part of the obligation of Israel as a Jewish state to take this into account clearly. In the way, again, that we call for, expect, rightfully, a general solidarity of the people. And I think part of our resilience has to do with that sense of solidarity through the generation.
Thank you. Thank you. We have two questions dealing with the Holocaust. One from Mark Miller asking if there are lessons we can draw upon from the Holocaust toward achieving peace between Jews and Palestinians. And Carl Rower asks if you could comment on the role of faith or belief in God in the Holocaust. And I don't know if they're connected, but I leave that to you, Professor.
Yeah, I think, well, I'm starting with the second question. Clearly, faith is a resource of transcending your condition, right? You say, well, there is something I can lean on, right? Something above me, a promise, a hope. Though the Holocaust itself was a real challenge to faith in many different ways, and it's a complex relationship. But faith for certain communities and people was a great resource of overcoming. By the way, it was also a great resource of great acts of compassion done towards Jews by Gentiles who risked themselves to save them in different communities, and some of them were faith-based. Some of them had to do with deeply, I think, Huguenots in France, who being victims of Catholic persecution for so many generations of having this experience. Some of them were, by the way, a very interesting place. And here I'm going to come to the second question. The only country in Europe where actually the number of Jews grew in the Holocaust. There were more Jews in that place, in that country, in 1945 than in 1939. That's a miracle. I mean, given the disaster, it was Albania. And when you look at the Albanian story, and you ask yourself, how did that happen? Well, these were Muslims whom for the idea of hospitality was so deep that if a refugee and a helpless person knocks on your door, you provide a shelter. You're going to defend that person. So yes, I mean, faith was and is a source of transcendence. We read in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, where Pharaoh wants a genocide, right? He begins with enslavement, and then he says to the midwives, kill all the babies, the male babies who are born. And then, ותראינה המילדות את האלוהים, ולא עשו כאשר דיבר אליהם. They were God-fearing, and they didn't, and disobey. The power to disobey. It's a deep power to resist evil, because you say, well, I'm not defined by the social reality I'm in. There is something beyond it. There is a moral, spiritual commitment here. So clearly, that's a place. What can we learn of the Holocaust vis-a-vis the hope for peace, right? Yeah, I mean, some deep enmities in Europe, right? Between France and Germany and other nations who fought to death. And they saw a way out of that. I mean, can we learn from that experience? And then I think the main obstacle for peace is dehumanization of the other side and collectivization of the other side. Dehumanization and collectivization. It's like a one evil entity. And how to overcome that, how to establish trust. I think after the 7th of October, the prospects of this peace has diminished, given the mistrust, given that actually that makes a greater challenge and a greater responsibility to try to achieve it and use our human imagination. Where are there areas in which common grounds is? By the way, in Jerusalem, there are three areas where you see the common grounds. First, in a hospital, you come to Hadassah, our hospital, the hospital of the Hebrew University, attached to the Hebrew University. There you see, by the way, first of all, 40% of the staff, I think, both the medical staff is Palestinian, but the patient, that's the most humanistic area in the city, then the National Library, and then the classes at the Hebrew University. So you ask yourself, where are there areas of life where encounter is not framed by enmity. And how can we enlarge it? What does it mean to enlarge them, to embrace them, to include them? That's a big, big role that we have in terms of the future and how to face the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think on that somewhat optimistic note, we'd like to close this session. It has been wonderful. Roland, would you like to say a few closing words?
Well, just to thank you and really appreciate the warmth of your message and, the content. And I think it leaves room for a lot of thinking. And I hope to do something in a positive way to help both Israel Jews and diaspora and, on a long-term basis. Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the questions. I've learned a lot from them, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you all. And we will see you at our next webinar. Thank you for joining us this evening.